This is Jim with Embervane, and today we're going to talk about the basic building blocks of music production. When you're working inside of your DAW, the core unit of everything, the container which holds the stuff that makes songs, is called a track. Now, you might hear this referred to as a stem or something else, but the reality is that it's that horizontal line that identifies some kind of marker that says everything in this container should be treated a certain way. And stacking those track containers on top of one after another gets us into the mix of things, which then are blended together to give us our final output song. Now, these tracks typically are going to be assigned to a singular instrument, like a bass guitar, or maybe a kick drum, as a microphone might come in. However, sometimes we see clumps of instruments on there, like an entire drum loop has multiple individual drum instruments, and yet it's contained inside of this track. Well, that's all fine, because these are all just pieces of ways that you can build your song. Now, when you are looking at a track overall, a song, right, overall, and you're looking at these individual tracks that are inside it, one of the things to note is that what can actually be sitting inside of these things? You could have, at the highest level, an audio file. This would be an example like a voice or a recording of an instrument with a microphone. That should give you an audio waveform that would sit on an audio style track. You could also have an instrument or MIDI style track. In this case, you might see little dashes and lines that appear across time, which would be used as data, programmatic data, that can control a virtual instrument. Now, on the subject of MIDI, and this is one where it can get a little weird because it's like, what is this stuff anyway? This is principally what MIDI is and how it is used inside of a DAW. There is this thing called a piano roll. And the piano roll looks like a piano vertical on one side, and then it just has effectively like little tracks. They're not called tracks, but each note has this space where you say, at a certain point in time, I want you to play this note at a certain volume and for a certain length. And what happens is you get this series of dashes that move up and down that piano roll. I think the easiest way to explain this is that it's basically like the inside of a music box. If you think about a music box, you have these pitched tines. They are sticks of little metal that are sticking out. And then there's this roller, our piano roll in this case, and there's these little protrusions, these nibs that stick out and bing, hit those tines to cause them to make tones. And as that music box spins, those little placements are basically saying, play these notes across different times, just like a hand might be playing notes on a piano. That's what MIDI is doing for a virtual instrument. Now, a virtual instrument is not like a guitar that we would record, a vocal that we would record, a piano that we would record. Instead, it is music that is generated entirely inside the computer. How? Well, it uses this virtual instrument, which commonly is going to either have some kind of computer program, which is basically modeling a certain type of instrument behavior, or it will use recorded samples. A sample is nothing more than a small section of recorded sound, like a trumpet playing a C note, and then a D note, and then an E note. And depending on which note I'm playing on the computer or my MIDI controller, I'll trigger that specific sample, just like inside the music box. These virtual instruments also include things like synthesizers. Something that says, tell me what note you want me to play, how hard you want me to play it or loud, and how long you want me to play it for. Now, you might remember from earlier that if a track is not a MIDI or instrument track, it will be an audio track. Audio tracks are going to be recorded audio. Now, it could be a sample or a loop that you're dragging in. You may not have done the recording. However, it was at one point recorded or created in a way to be bounced out into this waveform. The waveform looks like that because it can go up and down with the volume of the audio across time. And typically that's what you'll look at when you see an audio track. You're going to see this kind of like loud and quiet sections that are coming up. If you're looking at a drum track that's just hitting a snare drum, it might be quick, sharp little ticks. If you're listening to somebody sing longer notes, it might be more like a regular wave. Either way, it's all audio. So if you want to drop samples or you want to record your own voice or record a guitar or what have you, anything that you're going to record with a microphone is going to come into these audio tracks. The audio tracks and the virtual instrument MIDI tracks, they will be blended then into the whole song. And this gives you quite a range of possibilities when choosing different sounds or textures or character for your song work. Now, once we have these tracks with either some kind of audio or some kind of MIDI virtual instrument information on there, can you do anything further? The answer is yes. From here, we can add what's called processing. You may hear this referred to as, hey, I threw a plugin on, or I threw an EQ or a compressor, or what have you. Those are just names for types of processing. And processing simply means take the original sound, affect it in some way to get a different sound on the back end. Now, sometimes this is done for creative purposes. You may say, I've got this sound, but I want it to be something different. You may have a violin playing, but instead you want it to be almost haunting and as a texture. So you might run it through a reverb and make it so it's just sort of this washy sound instead. That is one way that you could process the sound. Although typically what would happen is our core sound will be processed to try to make it cleaner. Might edit out some, let's say, noise or spots that we don't like. It could also be used to make it more pronounced. How about changing the frequency volume of different pitches? You may find that if you record something, you're like, there's no low end on this thing, and I need it to have more oomph. You might use an equalizer to boost that up. All of this falls under the realm of processing. And in music production, as you're making a song, processing will be an important part of the process of making this end result. However, a common beginner mistake is to start diving into processing before we have other elements of the song put together. So while you can process, just think that typically this is something that's done a little bit later inside of the song making steps, right? The whole journey of this. And speaking of that journey, check the link below, as there in the description or pinned comments is a link to the SparkFlow map. This is a free resource by Embervane. It's about a 35-page document that walks you through the beginning ideas phase of a song all the way to, hey, I've got it done and finished, and talks about the kind of mistakes you can avoid and what you can do along the way to keep yourself moving forward. A cool free resource. Now, as we brought up this idea of these steps of the cycle of making a song, it's important to understand that this is where we get to something called arranging or the arrangement. Now, this again is a term that has a little bit of a looser definition for some people, but broadly speaking, this is what we're trying to do with an arrangement. We are trying to take different sections of the song, like chapters of a book, and create the entire journey of where the song is going to go to and from and take the listener with. In addition to that, we're going to make instrument selection choices here. Now you're going to say, Jim, we already talked about recording instruments. Why are we talking about this now? Well, technically, this video isn't covering the beginning to end process step by step. It's rather saying, here are all the building blocks that you need to pay attention to when you're making a song. So instrument selection is important. Sometimes we get an idea in the beginning. We say, you know what, I'll play this on a guitar. It sounds cool. Only to find later as the song progresses that the arrangement may work better if that same part were played on a different instrument, like a saxophone or a piano. This is part of the arrangement choices. How do we deliver the emotional intent and carry that emotional arc story all the way across the song to its greatest intent? Now, after you've arranged the song, you've got the sections in order, the different instruments that'll come in and play which parts across the range of melody and harmony and chords and all that jazz. After all of that, we then enter the phase that was called the mixing phase. The mixing phase takes these prepared ingredients and then blends them together into a final solitary audio file. that would blend all of those tracks, those individual parts together. This is very much like cooking a dish, where if a dish has a certain number of ingredients and the ingredients were prepared earlier, you then cook it, which is really this mixing part. After we've cooked it, you don't go back in and say like, hey, you know what, it's too bad, I should change this instrument over here. It's like that choice should have been made in the arrangement step. So when you are working on mixing, here is the spot where that processing that we talked about before definitely comes into play, but it's probably not as much creative. It's probably more about saying, can I clearly hear the different instruments in the mix? Are they sitting on the sound stage? So something's off to the right or to the left or dead center, where it allows our brains as the listener to hear things very clearly and feel like we are either in a tighter spot or a bigger spot. How about things like reverb or delay? These sort of choices affect the spatial sense of what the listener is going to hear. Should this song sound like it's in a cozy little room, like an intimate feeling? Should it sound like it's big and huge, like a cinematic, epic action score? Well, those choices come into play on the mixing side of things. And in the end, as everything comes together, all those tracks, there's things called buses, which is nothing more than a mini routing, mini mix, if you will, a group of tracks that get blended together to then further get blended. We end up with our final mix, either called a rough mix or a final song. Now from there, the next step is to take it to mastering. And the purpose of mastering is to add the final touches and final loudness adjustments to then make your song comparable to other songs in the public realm like it. In other words, if I was going to drop this song into a playlist of other songs like it, does it sound about the right loudness? Does it feel like it's the same kind of song in the same genre? If so, rock and roll. That's the job of the mastering engineer, among other things. Now, overall, we have talked about, at a high level, these different elements of a music production process, meaning to produce a song that you have an idea for. Sometimes, different people are involved along different stages of this process. That's cool. Sometimes, you get to be a one-man band, so to speak, and go from soup to nuts all the way through it. That's also fine. But the most important part is to remember that these building blocks are the fundamental steps of song making. We are not talking about tips and tricks. We are talking about the core knowledge necessary to be able to say I can construct from an idea, maybe even just a couple notes, a full song that actually hits hard, works right, or moves people the way we want it to. All right, that covers it for this video. If you got something out of it, drop a like, hit subscribe, and let me know in the comments what you'd like me to break down next. And if you want to check out the full interactive article on this topic, just click on the link in the description below. Now go make some music, and I'll catch you in the next one.